Let's begin the show with a look at the state of Texas. There last night, a mentally disabled man was executed. Marvin Wilson was convicted of killing a police informant 20 years ago. He had an IQ of 61, well below the average of 70, the number considered to be the bare minimum to determine competency. After months of appeals that reached all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, Wilson lost his battle. Texas, of course, is no stranger to the death penalty. It currently is at the top when it comes to executing prisoners on death row. Perhaps it's no surprise then when Texas Governor and former presidential candidate Rick Perry spoke about it, he got this reaction.
The state of Texas has a very thoughtful, a very clear process in place. You will face the ultimate justice in the state of Texas, and that is you will be executed.
What do you make of
So a large applause there for Texas Governor Rick Perry. Marvin Wilson was the 245th inmate executed under the governor, and the entire story was largely ignored by the media. Independent journalist Rania Khalek has been following this story closely, though, and joins us from Fairfax, Virginia. Hey there, Rania. I know in 2002, this U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that the mentally disabled could not be executed. What was different this time?
That's actually what has a lot of legal scholars shocked. In fact, that yesterday, court wouldn't grant a stay of execution for Marvin Wilson, even though he had been diagnosed by a court-appointed neuropsychologist, retarded, and had an IQ of 61, which is very much below the competency threshold of 70. So, you know, it's kind of shocking because in 2002, like you said, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional. So it came as a shock to his lawyers, and it really came as a shock to a lot of people. They were expecting the Supreme Court to side with their own ruling.
I know, Rania, you wrote a piece for Salon in which you talked about a set of standards, it seems to me some very non-scientific ones, inspired by Lenny in the book of Mice and Men to determine this characterization. So, I mean, I'm wondering, are you saying a fictional character invented by John Steinbeck was actually used as an example of precedent?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. In 2002, when the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional, right, to execute people with mental disabilities, they basically left it up to the states to determine how they were going to apply that standard. So most of the death penalty states passed statutes of some sort saying, you know, that basically adopted clinical standards, the same kind of standards used in Atkins to determine if someone's mentally disabled. Texas, on the other hand, didn't adopt anything. So when a case came forward to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in 2004, the Court of Criminal Appeals went ahead and invented temporary standards. And they used as inspiration, which you can see in their opinion, this character, Lenny Small, from John Steinbeck's book of Mice and Men, which is a fictional character who has, you know, who's severely mentally handicapped. So they use this as sort of the benchmark, so that they base these 7 standards around this character. So the standards are completely non-clinical, completely unscientific, have not been used by any scientists, clinicians whatsoever in diagnosing mental disability.
And Rania, you reached out to John Steinbeck's family in writing your article. What was their response to all this?
Well, what they did was they released, his son, Thomas Steinbeck, released a statement basically saying that his family was disgusted, that they hadn't known until this particular case that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals was using this character from his father's book as an example. So, but I tried to actually contact them, but they actually just said, we're going to let our statement stand. And it's a pretty powerful statement, and I included most of the quotes from it in the article. But yeah, I mean, this is something that obviously John Steinbeck can't say or comment on this because he's passed away, but his family clearly believes that he would be disgusted by this, as I think most people would. I mean, you're using a fictional character rather than science to determine who is competent enough to be put to death.
I think that certainly is a bigger picture problem with the system than just this case alone. I know, though, in this case, law enforcement said Wilson was trying to manipulate the system by faking his disability. What's your take on that?
Well, my take on that is that a court-appointed neuropsychologist, board-certified doctor, is actually sat down with this man and spent time clinically evaluating him and determined from there, based on a multitude of nationally recognized certified tests and lots of time spent with him, that he was mentally retarded. So aside from that, I'm not really sure what else a court needs. The really shocking thing about Texas is that they're basically, they've invented these standards, and the Supreme Court said it was okay that they had used these standards to deny this man a stay. And it's really shocking. I mean, people sitting on a court turning to a fictional character for a medical diagnosis is really insane in and of itself.
Let me ask you this. I mean, regardless of his IQ, Wilson was convicted of killing a police informant 20 years ago. I guess, Rania, what do you think that the government of Texas should have done with him?
Well, judging by the fact that he clearly is mentally disabled, they shouldn't have executed him, that is for sure. And they should make sure, in cases like that, I mean, they should make sure that these people have good representation, good legal counsel, which oftentimes is not the case. I mean, that's one of the reasons that the Supreme Court ruled you couldn't execute people with mental disabilities, because they were vulnerable to wrongful convictions, and they were vulnerable to having, crappy representation and not being able to, help themselves. So I think that the state of Texas needs to adopt regular standards. I mean, I would say the state of Texas needs to stop executing people, period. But since that won't be a reality, I don't think anytime soon, they should be using science to determine, they should be using doctors and science to determine whether people are mentally ill, mentally disabled, or whatever else medically needs to be diagnosed.
And Rania, I know you were following this really for quite a while now, but I want to talk to you about the lack of coverage overall on this case. I know we checked various websites, and we discovered it took several clicks of searching to find out anything written about this case. I know, nothing really on the front page of CNN or Fox or MSNBC before or after this happened. You often had to click on, 3 or 4 or 5 different pages before you even got to the story. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of it is that people are just not sympathetic to quote unquote criminals. Somebody who's been convicted of taking someone else's life, people immediately just don't care. Also, there's a huge stigma that surrounds mental disabilities and mental illness. I mean, there was a man in Texas just a week prior who was almost executed, but luckily his execution was staged, who was severely schizophrenic. That was almost put to death in Texas as well, and he didn't receive much attention either. And I think a lot of that has to do with that people are just not, they don't understand mental illness, they don't understand mental retardation either. Those are obviously both two different things, but and on top of that, Americans don't think the death penalty is that big of a deal. They don't realize the injustices that are inherent in the criminal justice system that lead to wrongful convictions, and they don't understand that the death penalty isn't a good deterrent. It doesn't work as a deterrent to murder or things that can get you the death penalty. So, and I think the media at this point, Texas has executed so many people. I mean, 245 under one governor is insane. I think that it's become normalized. It's like it's not a story anymore.
Certainly, that's somewhat apparent, at least, when Rick Perry spoke back at the early Republican presidential debate, and that just, roaring applause that he got for mentioning it. It is really interesting, especially when you compare the attitude about the death penalty here in the U.S. to other, developed European countries. It's very different. Thank you for following the story. Always great to have you on the show. Independent journalist Rania Khalek.
Thanks, Christine.